Ren Castellano almost didn't get off the bus. She'd had 3 days to change her mind. 3 days since she'd signed her name on a contract that felt more like a lifeline than a marriage. And now, watching the dust rise off a gravel road that led to absolutely nowhere, she understood why people called this kind of arrangement crazy. The driver had already pulled her suitcase down from the luggage compartment and set it on the shoulder of the road like he was setting down a stray dog nobody wanted. Behind her, the bus pulled away, gravel popping under its tires, and then it was just her and the silence and a truck idling 50 feet off with a man leaning against the driver's door, arms crossed, watching her like he wasn't sure she was real either. She made herself walk toward him. He was taller than she'd pictured from the 2 emails they'd exchanged through the agency, broader across the shoulders, sunburned in that permanent way of someone who worked outside every day of his life. He had a gray t-shirt with a faded logo she couldn't place, and jeans gone soft and pale at the knees, and he was looking at her the way you'd look at something that had wandered onto your property, and you weren't sure yet if it was dangerous. "You're Garrett Bowen," she said. It wasn't really a question. The agency had sent a photo. "And you're Ren." He said it slow, testing the shape of it. "Castellano, that's right." He didn't move to take her bag, not at first, and she appreciated that more than she could explain. She'd spent the last 2 years of her life with men who took things before she offered them. He just stood there, working his jaw like he was chewing on something he wanted to say and thought better of. "Long way to come for a piece of paper," he finally said. "I had my reasons." She picked up her own suitcase before he could change his mind about helping. "You had yours too, I assume." Nobody marries a stranger off the internet because things are going great. That got something out of him, not quite a laugh, but close. "Fair enough." He nodded toward the truck. "It's a 40-minute drive. Phone signal drops out for most of it, so if you were planning on calling anybody to come rescue you, better do it now." "I wasn't planning on being rescued." She climbed into the passenger seat before he could open the door for her, because she needed him to understand, right away, in the first 5 minutes, that she wasn't someone who waited around. "I was planning on rescuing myself. This was just the fastest way to do it." He glanced at her sideways as he pulled onto the road, and there was something careful in it, something that catalogued the bruise of exhaustion under her eyes, and the way her hands stayed folded too tightly in her lap. He didn't ask. She was grateful for that too. The ranch, when they finally got to it, sat at the bottom of a long valley with mountains going purple in the evening light, and despite everything, despite the panic clawing under her ribs, despite the absolute insanity of what she'd just done, something in her chest loosened at the sight of it. The house needed paint, the fence needed mending in at least 4 places she could see from the truck, but it was quiet, and it was far, and nobody who knew her name would think to look for her here. "It's not much," Garrett said, like he could read the assessment happening behind her eyes. "It's enough," she said, and meant it more than he could know. Inside, the house smelled like coffee gone cold and wood smoke, and something underneath that she eventually placed as loneliness. The particular staleness of a place where one person had been living a life meant for 2. He showed her the room that would be hers, separate from his, a fact he stated plainly, like he wanted it understood before she could even ask. And then he stood in the doorway a beat too long. "Why me?" he asked. "Agency had a dozen other guys on that list. You picked the one in the middle of nowhere with a ranch that's barely breaking even. Why?" She set her suitcase on the bed and didn't turn around right away, because she needed a second to decide how much truth to give him. "Because nobody would think to look for me in the middle of nowhere," she said finally. "That's the whole answer you're getting tonight." He didn't push. He just nodded once and left her alone with the dark coming down outside the window, and 4 years of careful planning finally paying off. She learned the rhythm of the place fast. She'd always been a fast learner. It was one of the only things nobody had ever managed to take from her. Up before light, coffee on the stove, boots in the mud by 6. Garrett ran cattle and a small herd of goats and sold eggs and honey at the farmer's market in town on Saturdays, and within 2 weeks Ren had rearranged his entire bookkeeping system, because the one he had was a shoebox of receipts and a prayer. "You're an accountant," he said, watching her build a spreadsheet at the kitchen table with a focus that bordered on ferocious. "I was a lot of things," she said, not looking up. "Before." He let that sit. He was good at letting things sit. She was learning. better than most men, who needed to fill every silence with a question or a joke or a hand on your shoulder that asked for more than it offered. Garrett just worked and ate dinner across from her in a quiet that slowly, day by day, stopped feeling like a held breath and started feeling like something closer to peace. Town was harder. The first Saturday she came with him to the market. The whispers started before they'd even unloaded the truck. A woman named Sandra Pruitt, who ran the quilting circle, and apparently considered herself the unofficial historian of every marriage in the county, planted herself at their stall, with her arms crossed. "Didn't know you were seeing anyone, Garrett," she said, looking Wren up and down like she was pricing livestock. "Wasn't anything to tell until it was done," Garrett said evenly. Sandra's eyes stayed on Wren. "And where'd you say you were from, honey?" "I didn't say." Wren smiled, the kind of smile she'd perfected in rooms full of men who wanted to own her. "But I make a very good lavender honey if you're buying." Sandra bought nothing and left in a huff, and Garrett, loading jars back into a crate, said quietly, "You didn't have to be polite to her. I wasn't being polite." Wren counted out change for the next customer without missing a beat. "I was being strategic. There's a difference." He looked at her like he was trying to solve something. She let him look. She wasn't ready to be solved yet. What she didn't tell him, not that first month, not the second, was the actual shape of what she was running from. She let him assume it was an ordinary kind of bad. A bad marriage, a bad family, the kind of bad that was sad but survivable, and didn't follow you across state lines with money behind it. She let the silence between them fill in the rest, because the truth had a name attached to it, and the name had power, and she was terrified that saying it out loud, even here, even this far from everything, might be enough to summon it. The name was Marcus Voss. He'd found her when she was 22 and brilliant with numbers, and broke in a city that ate broke girls for breakfast, and for a while it had felt like rescue. The apartment, the clothes, the sense that someone powerful had decided she mattered. It took 2 years to understand that mattering, to Marcus, meant belonging. He ran a private investment fund that moved through 3 continents and answered to almost nobody, and when she'd finally tried to leave, he'd explained to her, very calmly, over a glass of wine that cost more than her first car, that leaving wasn't actually an option she had. She'd spent the next 18 months learning how to disappear in plain sight, building a paper trail that led nowhere, saving cash he couldn't trace, and finally, finding a mail order arrangement so far off the grid that even Marcus's people, with all their money and their patience, might not think to check it. She thought she'd been careful enough. She was wrong. It was a Tuesday in late autumn, frost on the fence posts, breath fogging in the morning air, when the letter came from the county. Garrett read it twice at the kitchen table before he set it down and rubbed both hands over his face. "What is it?" Wren asked. "Bank's calling the loan." His voice was flat in the way men's voices got when they were trying not to let panic in. "I'm behind on the note from when I bought out my brother's half of the place. 3 years behind technically, but they let it ride as long as I made the interest. Now there's a development company buying up the paper on half the ranches in this valley, and they're not interested in letting anything ride." "What development company?" "Calls itself Holbrook Group. Big outfit, building some kind of resort corridor through here, golf, lake houses, the whole thing. They've already bought out the Renner place and the old marsh spread." He pushed the letter across the table to her. "I've got 90 days to make good on the note or they take the land." Wren read it twice, and something in her, the part of her that had spent 4 years learning to read contracts the way other people read weather, went very still and very sharp. "Let me see your books," she said. "All of them. Tonight." By midnight she had spread every financial document Garrett owned across the kitchen table, and by 1 in the morning she had found what she suspected she'd find. A pattern in the interest calculations that didn't add up, fees buried in fine print that shouldn't have been legal. A loan structure designed, she was almost certain, to be unwinnable from the start. "They never wanted you to pay this off," she said, tapping the page. "They wanted you to default. It's a land grab dressed up as a mortgage." Garrett stared at her across the table, exhaustion and something like hope warring on his face. "How do you know that? Because I used to build instruments exactly like this one," she said quietly. "For people exactly like whoever's running Holbrook Group. I know what a trap looks like from the inside." He didn't ask more that night, but 2 days later, After she'd spent every spare hour cross-referencing public filings on the kitchen laptop, he found her staring at a name on the screen that had made her hands go cold. Halbrook Group's parent holding company was registered to a private equity fund out of 3 states away. The fund's managing partner was Marcus Voss. She didn't tell Garrett. Not that night, not the next. She told herself she needed time to think, but the truth was simpler and uglier. She was afraid that the moment she said his name out loud, it would become real in a way it hadn't been since she'd run, and Garrett would look at her differently, the way people always looked at women who came with this much wreckage attached. She threw herself into the ranch instead. She rebuilt the books from scratch, negotiated better rates with 2 of his suppliers, doubled their honey sales by rebranding everything with a story instead of a price tag. Small batch, single source, raised on land that's been in the same family for 3 generations, and watched the Saturday market line grow longer week by week. Garrett watched her do it with an expression she didn't have a name for yet, something between awe and worry, like he could feel her building something furiously and couldn't tell if she was building toward survival or away from him. "You work like you're trying to outrun something," he said one night, both of them counting cash at the table, the wood stove ticking as it cooled. "Maybe I am. You ever going to tell me what?" She closed the ledger. "Would it change anything? Between us, I mean. If you knew." He thought about it longer than she expected, like he was actually weighing the question instead of reaching for the easy answer. "I don't know," he said finally, "but I'd rather know and decide than not know and wonder." She almost told him then. She had the words lined up. "His name is Marcus Voss, and he thinks he owns me, and he just bought the loan on your land without even knowing it was yours." But headlights swept across the window at that exact moment. A car coming up the long drive that had no business being there at 9 o'clock on a Thursday night. And the words died in her throat. Garrett was up first, moving toward the door with the particular calm of a man who dealt with coyotes and bad weather and knew how to handle trouble without raising his voice. Wren followed 2 steps behind, and when the car door opened and a man unfolded himself from the driver's seat into the porch light, she felt the floor tilt under her. Marcus hadn't changed. That was the worst part. He still wore his suits like armor, still moved like a man who'd never once in his life been told no and meant it. "Hello, Wren," he said, like they'd seen each other yesterday. "You've gotten very good at disappearing. I'm almost proud." "Get off this property," Garrett said, stepping between them. Marcus's smile didn't waver. "You must be the husband." The desperate rancher who married a stranger off the internet. His eyes flicked to Wren, cataloging, possessive in a way that made her skin crawl even from 10 feet away. "Did she tell you why she ran? Or did she let you believe it was something small and forgivable?" "She doesn't owe you an explanation for anything," Garrett said. "And neither do I. Get back in your car. I own the paper on your land." Marcus said it lightly, almost kindly, which made it worse. "Did you know that? 90 days, and then I own this whole valley, piece by piece, and her along with it. Because where else is she going to go? You think she married you for love? She married you because she ran out of better options." Something hot and furious rose up in Wren's chest, burning past the fear that had owned her for 4 years. "You don't get to talk about me like I'm not standing here," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I left because you taught me what ownership feels like, and I decided I'd rather die broke and free than live one more day belonging to you." Marcus's jaw tightened, the first real crack in the performance. "You'll regret this." "I regret a lot of things," Wren said. "You're not one of the ones I get to fix tonight. But this ranch isn't yours yet, and I have spent 4 years learning exactly how men like you hide what they're doing in fine print. You're going to want to leave before I show my husband, and a federal regulator I happen to know personally, exactly what I found in your loan documents." It wasn't entirely a bluff. She'd spent 2 years before Marcus working compliance at a fund that had once been investigated for the very same kind of predatory structuring she'd found buried in Halbrook's paperwork, and she still had a contact who owed her a favor. Marcus looked at her for a long moment, something calculating behind his eyes, and then for the first time in 4 years, he was the one who looked away first. "This isn't over," he said, but he was already walking back to his car. "It is for you," Wren said. "It's just starting for me." He didn't come back that night, and he didn't come back the next, but the fear of it sat in the house for days afterward like smoke that wouldn't clear. Garrett didn't ask her to explain right away. He waited until they were sitting on the porch steps. 2 evenings later, the goats settling for the night, the whole valley going gold and then gray, and then he just said quietly, "Tell me." So she did. All of it. The apartment, the wine, the 18 months of careful disappearing, the terror of building a life, only to watch it get bought out from under her by the same hands that had built her cage in the first place. She told him about the compliance job, about the contact at the regulator's office, about exactly how she planned to bury Halbrook Group in its own fraudulent paperwork before the 90 days were up. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished, the silence that followed wasn't the kind she'd been afraid of. It was the kind that held weight without crushing her under it. "You could have told me sooner," he said finally. "I know. Why didn't you? Because every man I've ever told the truth to has used it against me eventually." She looked at him directly, because he deserved that much. "I needed to know you weren't going to be one of them before I handed you the rest of myself, and now I think you're the first one who isn't." He reached over and took her hand, slow, like he was asking permission with the gesture instead of taking it, and she let him, because for the first time in 4 years, being held didn't feel like being caught. The fight, when it came, wasn't against Marcus directly. He was smarter than that, too careful to be caught standing over the wreckage himself. It came through paperwork, through 3 brutal weeks of Wren, working the phone and the laptop until 2 in the morning, pulling every favor she had left, filing every complaint that mattered, working with a sympathetic examiner at the state banking regulator's office to flag Halbrook Group's loan practices across 4 counties, not just Garrett's note. It turned out the Renner place and the Marsh spread had been bled by the exact same predatory structure. And once 2 other ranching families came forward with their own paperwork, the pattern was undeniable. The bank that had originally written Garrett's loan, facing the regulatory heat, was forced to renegotiate the terms before Halbrook's purchase of the paper could even close. Fair terms, finally, terms a working ranch could actually meet. Halbrook's bid collapsed within the week. 2 weeks after that, Wren watched the local news with Garrett's arm around her shoulders as a reporter described a federal inquiry opening into a private equity fund's lending practices across 3 states, the fund's managing partner unavailable for comment. She didn't celebrate the way she thought she would. Mostly she just breathed, long, slow breaths, the first ones in 4 years that didn't feel like they were being measured out and rationed. "You did that," Garrett said, watching her face in the blue light of the TV. "We did that." She turned to look at him. "I couldn't have stayed long enough to fight if you hadn't given me somewhere to stand. I didn't do much. Just married a stranger and tried not to scare her off." "You did more than that." She leaned her head against his shoulder, something in her finally, fully unclenching after years of being braced for the next blow. "You let me be someone who fights instead of someone who runs. Nobody's ever done that for me before." Spring came slow, and then all at once, the way it does in mountain country, frost giving way to mud, giving way to green so sudden it almost hurt to look at. The honey stall at the Saturday market had a line now, regular customers who drove 40 minutes just for Wren's lavender batch, and Sandra Pruitt had, against all odds, become one of the more reliable ones, showing up every week with exact change and grudging respect she'd never quite admit to out loud. The loan was current, the fences were mended. Garrett had started talking, in the easy way of a man who finally believed in his own future again, about bringing in more cattle next season, about maybe building a second barn. Wren stood on the porch one evening. Watching him walk up from the lower pasture with that long, unhurried stride, she'd come to know, as well as her own heartbeat, and she thought about the woman who'd stepped off that bus 8 months ago, suitcase in hand, certain that this was just the fastest way out of one trap, and possibly into another. She hadn't been wrong to be afraid. She just hadn't known yet what it would feel like on the other side of it. "You're thinking too hard about something," Garrett said, climbing the porch steps, dust on his boots, sun behind him turning everything gold. "I'm thinking I almost didn't get off that bus," she said, "that first day. I almost told the driver to keep going. What stopped you?" "You were standing there." She smiled, and it didn't feel practiced the way her smiles used to. Didn't feel like a tool built to manage a room. "Looking like you weren't sure I was real either. I figured if a stranger could be that careful with someone he didn't owe anything to yet, maybe it was worth finding out what else he was capable of." Garrett reached for her hand, the same slow, asking way he always did, and she laced her fingers through his without hesitation, the way she hadn't been able to do with anyone in years. "For the record," he said, "I'm still not sure you're real. Best thing that ever happened to this place, and I keep waiting to wake up. You're not dreaming." She looked out at the valley, green and gold and entirely finally, theirs to keep fighting for. "I ran here to disappear. I never expected to find somewhere I wanted to be seen instead." He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. They stood together on the porch as the light went down over land that had nearly been taken from them twice and belonged, now only to the people brave enough to hold on to it. Two people who'd started as strangers on paper and become, somewhere in the wreckage and the rebuilding, each other's whole unguarded truth.